if you follow me across the parking lot, we're going to start with the Goodwin Funeral Home House. We'll do a welcome. Welcome, folks. My name is John Clayton, if you're lucky enough not to know who I am. I'm the Executive Director of the Manchester Historic Association, and I want to thank you for joining us on this Victorian walking tour of North Manchester, the North End specifically. Your tour guides will be Richard Duckoff and Matt Labby, and we're fortunate to have a tour guide emeritus in John Jordan standing over here. Welcome, John. And as I mentioned earlier, for those of you who are in the Witness Protection Program, this is going to be broadcast on Manchester Public Television. So if you don't want your identity revealed, you need to get in the back of the pack. And it is a very large pack. As you look around today, I think you can see that we've got a lot of people coming out for this. We're going to be walking on city streets, so I implore you to be aware of your surroundings. Try to stay on the sidewalk as best you can, because we certainly don't want to make history today by losing one of our guests. Got me? Okay. Again, we, the Manchester Historic Association, are a 501c3. We don't receive any city, state, or federal funding. We totally rely upon grants and memberships. I've given many of you membership brochures. If you're not a member, I hope you'll consider becoming one. We are fortunate to have a couple of our trustees here today. Pat Myers is here. Pat, raise your hand. Where did she go? Oh, there she is. She's sitting down already. She's smart. She's been on these tours. And Richard Duckoff is also a member of our board, so welcome to Dick as well. If you have any questions, I'm going to be kind of busy today. I'm going to be handling the microphone for Dick and Matt, and probably won't be easily accessed, but please reach out to me if you have questions about the association or any of our other programs. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Duckoff, and we'll begin the Victorian walking tour of North End of Manchester.
Just one question. Have any of you been on this tour before? How many of you have been? 1, 2, 3. Okay. So this will be familiar to many of you. First of all, I want to welcome you all to the Manchester Historic Association's tour of what used to be called the North End, reaching from the Blodgett Harrison area to the Manning Estate, today part of Brookside Congregational Church. With the exception of one home built in the early 1850s, the homes we will see, and whose original owners we will talk about, were built in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. These years correspond with a period when Manchester, both in population growth and economically, experienced a boom never seen before or since. We'll refer to the architecture of some of the homes we see today. You'll see a number of Victorian homes, and the Victorian house builders consciously set out to make houses that were beautiful. To them, ornamentation and decoration were an integral part of their beauty. Among some of the homes we will find such decorations as brackets, spindles, decorative shingles, oriels and bays, sawn wood ornaments, verge boards, tiles, etched stained glass, incised ornaments, appliques, and soaring chimneys. Oh, by the way, before this tour is over, we're going to answer a trivia question. And the trivia question we'll leave with you right now is, who was the first college graduate in the history of the city of Manchester? That's going to be answered by the end of this tour. It'll be part of the tour. I wanted to include that.
John Clayton.
Okay.
First of my family, yes.
And also, when we talk about the ornamentation, a lot of these terms are not familiar to you. They weren't familiar to me when I first started studying for this tour many years ago. But there are certain things that I would ask you to really try to remember. One is the word finial, F-I-N-I-A-L. The other is asymmetry. We're so accustomed to 2 windows on the left side of the front entry, 2 on the right. Everything is absolutely symmetrical. We're dealing with a period where the architects got bored. People got bored with the sameness, and they wanted something new, just like the cars used to have fins at one time. Now they all look alike. You don't know. I don't know. If I see a car on the highway, I don't know if it's a Ford or a Chevy or a Maserati. I mean, I can't tell the difference anymore. So maybe that'll shift again someday. And the other one is wraparound porches and soaring chimneys. Now, when talking about finials, let's look at this house. This house has more finials, guaranteed, I mean, I'll be willing to give anybody $10, show you how liberal I am. If you can find a house with more finials than this, look at the Carriage House. Finials are on the peaks of roofs. And there's got to be at least 8 to 10 finials, and they're gorgeous. And we're going to see other houses today with these beautiful finials, and they were specialized work that was done by metalsmiths that don't even exist today anymore of that quality. Now we're going to move on to the house. This imposing estate was constructed in 1873 by doctor and shrewd businessman Elijah M. Tubbs, a dentist from Peterborough. His fortune, however, was made from a patent medicine called Ring's Vegetable Ambrosia, a hair restorer. It was marketed to balding men. This elixir was shipped throughout the country. He shipped in 1869 by a newspaper article 580,000 pounds of freight in 1 year. It was shipped throughout the country. The ads were in hundreds of newspapers throughout the country. Just to give you an idea, because since the last time I did this tour, actually I bought a bottle of it. I haven't used it, so I don't know if it works or not. But I can tell you, if you follow the directions, you're going to use up a whole bottle in 1 day. But the cost was $1 a bottle. And if you consider, just do how much it weighed and the number of ads, the man made a fortune. He made an absolute fortune. The architect for the home was from New York City and the contractor from Springfield, Mass., but the brickwork and the granite work are done by local firms. The source of the foundation was Clark's Ledge, just south of Reedy Street in the North End. The same quarry that 25 years earlier had supplied the columns for our City Hall. In 1878, when Dr. Tubbs died, the property was sold to the Ambuscade Manufacturing Company for a reported $23,000. It would be easier if you held this, actually.
Okay, 1 second.
It was used as a residence for Colonel Thomas Livermore, the company's agent, and his successor, Herman F. Straub. In 1929, it was sold to Elmer Goodwin, by whom, with his descendants, it has been used as a funeral home. The reported price at the time of the sale was $30,000. You might be interested to know that 2 different sales have taken place in the last number of years. It's actually 3 now, I believe. The first 2 were these. The Goodwin family sold it in 2005 for $800,000, and it was sold again in 2010 for $1,100,000. It still remains a funeral home, however, and the name Goodwin is still on it. Architecturally, a contemporary newspaper article described the building as a Swiss design. There are amazing coincidences here about the ownership of the building. Remember now that Elijah Monroe Tubbs, was the first owner of this home. His mother traced her ancestry back to one William Monroe, one of the first settlers of Lexington, Mass. Interestingly, the ancestry of David Philip Goodwin on his maternal line can be traced to that same William Monroe. That's good. We're going to move across the street now, and we're going to be going to the Straub Mansion. So if you'll follow me, that school was built in 3 months. That's hard to believe. They'd think of how they used to be able to do things they could get.
So if you look across the street behind you, this brick building right here is the Straub Mansion. The Ezekiel Straub Mansion was built in 1870, and it was designed by George W. Stevens, who is also the architect of the Ash Street School, which is now on the Historic Register. The house contained 18 rooms, and it was built in an Italian villa style. It has a campanella, or a bell tower, on top, which you cannot see from this side. It had a large brick stable and a small cottage made of brick for the servants. Mr. Straub was agent of the Ambuscade Manufacturing Company and governor of New Hampshire. A family named Rowell, the original settlers of this land, had built a log cabin where the straw school now stands. We just passed it as we walked by. Though this property passed the Old Falls Road, a stagecoach road that led from Manchester Center to Amoskeag Village. It was considered as a site for the New Hampshire Hospital in 1887, and also for the Elliott Hospital before its erection in 1888. On October 14th, 1889, President Harrison was a guest of Governor Cheney here, Cheney owning the house at the time. This is also the same Cheney that was involved with Elijah Tubbs, who we talked about at the last house, who was a partner in the Cheney paper mills.
Let me just add one thing.
Mm-hmm. Please do.
You should be interested to know that the house is now owned by NeighborWorks of Southern New Hampshire. The house is number 11, which would be the one just south of it, that has white siding, is also owned by NeighborWorks. The one just north of it that used to be a motel, that's also owned by NeighborWorks of Southern New Hampshire. So that organization has really saved this property. It's well managed, it's a clean property, and
They just renovated.
it's been renovated, but it really has saved that building for the future.
And I believe we have one guest on the tour who resides in the Straub Mansion. Raise your hand.
Hey!
I'm sure she'll have stories to tell if you want to talk to her while we're walking along about living in that beautiful, beautiful building.
All right, if you look across the street at the brick building with the brownstone arches here, this is the Smith and Dao Block. It was constructed in 1892 by Frederick Dow, who was a Manchester shoe dealer, and also by Governor John Butler Smith of Hillsborough. The architect was William Butterfield, who you'll probably hear more about later today. It was heated by steam with 2 boilers built at the Blood's Locomotive Works. It was the desire of the builder to exclude from the building all chance for fire, and to this end, no modern appliances such as stove would be allowed in any part of the building. It was lighted by gas and had modern appliances such as a bathroom for every apartment. There were speaking tubes to the front entrance and 5 freight elevators in the rear. Rents were from $20 to $25 a month, so that's changed quite a bit in the last century. The parlors also had open fireplaces, and the finish throughout was cypress, beautiful, beautiful wood. And the lot that we're standing on here behind us is the Masonic Temple. Before 1920, when the Masons bought the land on which the temple you see before you stands, they had their eyes on the Straub Mansion and went so far as to have architects draw up designs which would have added to it, allowing it to run all the way to Brook Street. Prior to the construction of the temple, the Masonic Hall was in the Pembroke block on one of the top floors of what we remember as the James W. Hill building. The Masons had tripled in numbers in the 30 years prior to 1927 when the construction of this temple was completed. Thus, a building of this size was logical. In 1927, the number of Master Masons totaled 1,800 in the city alone. The building as a whole represents an old Grecian temple, described as simple in design, yet whose architectural strength and beauty symbolizes for all time the dignity and power of Masonry. The interior has a basement and 4 floors. The main lodge room is located on the 2nd floor. It's 2 stories in height, and its interior has the effect of an outdoor temple. So the ceiling is representative of the sky. It's painted with clouds, and when you turn the lights down, stars come out. It's really, really cool. Through these effects, you can have all variations between day and night that can be produced at will.
I think it's end of September.
Yep.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Where do all the brick come from? There's a lot of brick.
I don't know where the brick specifically for this building came from, but a lot of the brick in Manchester came from brickyards in Hooksett. They would take glacial lake sediment that settled at the bottom of the Merrimack River, and it's really, really fine, so it's great for making bricks. So they did that for all of the mills and probably some of these later buildings.
So how do they put these oxen down?
Repeat the question too. Yeah.
Yeah, so the question was, where did these bricks come from? And my answer is, I don't know. But many of the bricks in Manchester did come from the brickyards in Hooksett, where they would take these fine glacial sediments and turn them into brick. Typically that was before 1850, so at this point I'm not sure where they're coming from. But before 1850 they were shipped down on canal boats that came through the canals.
Okay, moving on.
Fairgrounds.
From where we're standing, it's easy to picture the land bordered by Webster Street on the north, Sagamore Street where we are on the south, Elm Street on the west, and Pine Street on the east. From the 1850s onwards until 1876, when Josiah Carpenter built his home, that's the home in back of me on the corner, it had an active and a varied history. Upon its grounds, regiments of men encamped and underwent training, what we would call today basic training, before leaving for duty to fight for the Union cause in the Civil War. And in 1864, 9 long buildings, 181 feet in length, plus a gangrene house, were erected here. Prior to this, wounded soldiers had been medically treated in field hospitals. The facility was called the Webster United States General Hospital. Until its closure about a year later, over 600 men were cared for here. In April 1866, only a few months after the closing of the hospital, the Manchester Riding Park was organized. The buildings, the hospital buildings, were taken by ox cart, and they went north and south between Hollis Street and Kidder, where those brick buildings are now, in the exact same place where the hospital buildings, where workers from the Amherst lived for many, many years until about 1905, when the buildings that are there today are the ones you still see. So this property was referred to as the Trotting Park. It was a stock company. It was organized under the leadership of Ezekiel Straub, Nathan Parker, and John B. Clark. The land, however, was leased from the Amherst Manufacturing Company. As a track for horse racing, it was a half-mile in length. By that I mean it was an oval track, and from start to finish would be a half-mile. It was pronounced one of the finest and the best in New England. It was a complete facility with an oval track, the long diameter running north and south. There were stables for the horses, and of course spectator stands and a judge's stand. This last, a tall structure, stood just west of the Noah S. Clark House. That would be about where Christmas trees have been sold for many years. In its existence, state fairs were held there, as well as circuses, and in 1870 and 1875, the New England and state fairs were held in conjunction. In these last cases, thousands of people came by train and flocked to the North End Trotting Park. In the autumn of 1877, the corporation was dissolved, one whose original shareholders represented the upper crust of the city. The south gate of the fairgrounds was on Sagamore Street, and the upper gate at the corner of Elm and what is today North Street. So this is where the south gate was to the fairgrounds, right here in back of me. The fairgrounds fence was moved so that batters could be put up on Joseph Carpenter's land, and a period in history ended, and a new era of Victorian home building began. So this, at this point, is where we're going to start looking at the Victorian homes. Directly across the street, I should first tell you, that would be across Elm Street. In May of 1872, workmen were leveling a hill for a home to be built by one Andrew Bunton, and they found 5 Indian skeletons in sitting positions with the teeth and skull well preserved. And in my study of the decomposition of skeletons, which I got into one night when I had nothing else to do, I found that generally they're not preserved for any long period of time unless they're in sand. And so this was very sandy soil, and it was really excellent for the preservation of skeletons.
Can I ask you real quick?
Yes.
Just one thing to add really quick. Amherst here is a major Indian site. You'll find Indian sites all up and down the river, and at Bellows Falls they also have a cemetery complex next to their waterfalls, so that may be something that's just common to native groups.
So what became of those bones?
What became of the bones? What became of the bones? At this time there was no protection for Native American remains, so they were most likely thrown out. In later years they have been sent to museums, and then they get repatriated under the 1992 NAGPRA law.
A certain portion are still in Dick's living room, but
It's actually, it's part of my coffee table, but don't tell a soul. In back of me is the Josiah Carpenter House, built in 1876. It's a Gothic Revival house. It was the first house built, as we've already said, on what were the old fairgrounds. Josiah Carpenter was a brother of Frank P. Carpenter, Manchester's most significant benefactor. He was also cashier of the Second National Bank, and his wife Georgia Drake was a direct descendant of Sir Francis Drake, the first English person to circumnavigate the globe. When excavating for this home, a tomahawk, arrowheads, and skull were found. The Carpenter family donated the parish house to the Grace Episcopal Church in memory of their daughter. Mr. Carpenter lived here until he died in 1913, and his widow, Georgiana, occupied it until about 1929. What you want to look about at this house is that it has verge boards, ornately carved or pierced verge boards. You can see them, can you not, up by the eaves? And they were fixed to the projecting edge of the gable roof. You can also see what by today's standards would be called a soaring chimney. This is the beginning of the Victorian era, and this house and the one just after it really signified a major, major change in Manchester's architecture. So we're about to see more of that change, and we're walking now to the house next door, just east of the Carpenter House. In back of me is the John Dolber House. John Dolber invented the window fastener, and throughout his career he was associated with the Manchester Hardware Company. In the newspaper of March 3rd, 1917, it was written, quote, "The house I built at the corner of Sagamore and Bay Street stands where the main ticket office to the old fairgrounds was formerly located." So there you have it in his own words. Now, as we look at this Victorian house, we find, first of all, a symmetry. Now, this was a shocking thing at its time. It was just outrageous. I mean, you compare a Model T to a 62 Cadillac with fins, and that's quite a change, right? Yeah. And you compare the ones with fins to today, and again, there's quite a change. So tastes change, but the Victorian architecture became a fad, and it lasted for a long period of time, and over time a lot of it has been destroyed by renovations on the outside, by siding, by other changes, and the day will come 100 years from now where this would be almost like a museum piece. What we see are wraparound porches. You can see that, can you not? That's a feature of Queen Anne Victorian. We see a tower. Do you see the tower there with a conical roof? By conical, it's like an upside down ice cream cone. That's the way I put it. You can see the recessed porches. They're recessed. They're not just wraparound. A recessed porch, actually, there's one that you can't see, but as we walk around the corner, there's another one on the Bay Street side, and I'll point that out as we walk around the house. And you'll see a variety, it's playful almost, of siding treatments. Do you see these different siding treatments? Can you imagine doing that today?
Oh, wow.
I mean, the house would just shoot up. It would break anybody.
Yeah.
Verge boards were not typical on the Queen Anne house. You see the wooden tracery on the pediments on the two sides of the front door. Do you see that tracery, the wooden tracery? And an Eastlake style means that you had three-dimensional posts with scroll brackets on the posts on the porch. You see those?
Yeah.
All right. So these are all, this house is almost like a teaching lesson, and we'll have one other house which is the ultimate teaching lesson in Victorian architecture. But this is a beautiful, beautiful house. The amount of work that's gone into preserving it is, you just can't quantify it.
Do people
people live there?
Yes, they do.
Is it a single family?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
I'm sure they love it.
All right, we're going to move on around the corner, and we're going to do more houses, but I'm going to just point out the recessed porch.
Does anybody know what these dangling microphone looking things are from the roof? Oh, okay.
Right here, yeah, they're plant hangers on the front porch here.
Oh, okay.
So there's one black one there, another one hanging from the second.
Yeah. Plant holders.
Apparently they're plant holders. I have to defer to experts that are more knowledgeable in this. I quickly defer. I just want to point out to everybody the recessed porch. Can you all look up and see that? There's one on the other side of the house, directly in the opposite side on the west side as well. Look at that gorgeous, gorgeous work. And look at the chimneys. I can't say enough about this house. Goes to Matt.
We good? We ready? Okay, so if you look at the house behind us, this house was built in 1886 for Mrs. Edward W. Harrington, who was the widow of a former mayor. In 1880, Mrs. Harrington, in partnership with Governor John Butler Smith, built the Smith-Harrington Block on Hanover Street, which was the home of the Manchester Opera House, which later became the Strand Theatre right next to the palace. Mrs. Harrington's late husband, shortly before his death in 1876, made the following prediction, quote, "The time is coming when the old fairgrounds at the North End are going to afford the most desirable and valuable sights in the city," end quote. He was absolutely right. Their daughter Selina was the mistress of Frank Jones, the wealthy Portsmouth, New Hampshire brewer. Upon his death, she sued his estate for services rendered to the late millionaire. Yep, the case was settled out of court for $140,000. Yes, that's a lot of money back then, minus $35,000 in lawyer's fees, and the home in Maine that she and the late brewer used as a love nest. Behind me, this brick building behind me at 15 Salmon Street is the William Butterfield house. He was a hay and grain dealer, and he built this house about 1886 for his own personal use. He supervised the construction personally. Unfortunately, he took ill and died before moving in, so his widow put the house up to auction in 1888. And the high bidder was Herbert Thayer, who paid $6,025 for the home. Yep. So now we're just going to move across to the other corner on Salmon Street.
And what happened was that it went through zoning, and then it was appealed. And then it went to the Superior Court. And the question was, does the planning department have any authority over an area where there is an architectural cohesion in the neighborhood to prevent this from coming? And I had a bet with the head of the planning department that the court would ban Dr. Berube from building the building, and the head of the planning department said no, that it was going to go through okay. And of course, we didn't bet any money; it was just a friendly bet. But I was there when the hearing took place in the courthouse, and Dr. Berube was sitting there, and I honestly believe that there's a chance that he was, I'm not saying it's certain, but there was a good chance he was trying to stick his finger in the eye of the North End. But it would have been out of place. I'm going to pass around a picture of it for you to look at.
What was the court ruling?
The court ruled in favor of the planning department. Just said they have authority to ban that building from being erected because of the fact that it wouldn't be consistent with the architectural integrity of the neighborhood.
There's a question.
That's a good question.
I don't think so.
There's more
Not
than one
here.
because it's a group.
Farther downtown.
I believe it's the one that's downtown. I can't. I used to know the name, but ma'am, excuse me if I don't remember the first name. Sorry about that.
Dick, the lady over here in the straw hat had a question. Is there a historic district here? And there is not here, but there is closer downtown.
Is there a historic district? An actual district? No, there isn't. But there is obviously. You know, architecturally it just exists, but it's a de facto thing. There's no legal, designation.
Where are we going?
This one. So if you want to look behind you, this home was built for Dr. Henry DeWolf Carvel, who was a prominent Manchester physician in 1882. And like many of the houses around here, it was also designed by William Butterfield, the local architect. Dr. Carvel lived here until 1890, and then he sold the house to George Gould. Mr. Gould was eventually to build the home where the former Notre Dame administration building stood on Elm and Trenton Streets. Mr. Gould built it as a wedding present for his daughter Mary. They were married in this house in October of 1895 while awaiting the completion of their new mansion. Carriage House? Do you want to do that one?
Yeah, no, you can do it.
Okay.
You walk up here.
If you look behind me, this is on.
Oh, sorry.
Does this work? Hello. If you look behind me, this unusual bank building is actually a carriage house. In 1889, Mrs. Charles Balch erected this carriage house, and after her death, it was sold to Aretas Carpenter, who was the son of Frank Carpenter, who built the city library. It was part of his estate until 1965. Acquired from the New Hampshire Insurance Company, the new owners, by the Merchants National Bank, it was converted into a branch bank. Ralph McInich, the bank president, was unquestionably the driving force behind the move to save the carriage house, converting it to new use. Now we're going to walk up and meet Dick to see the Carpenter House, I believe. Yes, the John Chandler House, sorry.
We're looking at the John M. Chandler House. I should say that this house, this corner actually, is probably the most significant corner for architecture in the city. Not just this house, the one across the street and the one on the other side are three houses that just stand out. And the house, the brick house, if you look toward Elm Street, is another one that we're going to be doing. And these four houses say so much about Manchester, so much about architectural styles, and so much about the city. These were built when the city was at its acme, at its all-time high as far as success. This home was built in 1889 for John M. Chandler, of the prominent Chandler family here in Manchester. It's a modified Queen Anne architecture. Mr. Chandler attended Dartmouth College, after which he became involved in the grocery business as the John M. Chandler and Company, which he sold in 1880. The same year, he became cashier of the Amherst National Bank. The Chandler family was deeply involved in the affairs of the bank, and it was natural that he should become cashier. He also played violin in the locally famous Walter Dignam Orchestra. And this house, it remained a private home until 1960, when it was converted to a multi-use property. The home, not only was it lived in by him, it was lived in by his widow until 1923. It was later lived in by Mayor Morrow. It was lived in after that by Dr. Parfit for a few years, and it was the Craig law firm for a number of years. So it's had a varied history. Right now, it's a law firm. I want to just mention that it's impossible really to do this house properly without spending a half an hour or more. We're just going to do our best. We're going to point out, first of all, we're going to point out the chimney, the towering chimney. We're going to point out something that is really exquisite, which is a multi-planed roof. When we're on the other side, on North Street, you're going to find another section of the roof that sweeps down from the peak all the way down to the first floor. It's really hard to describe it without actually seeing it. Look at the shingles. Look at the different treatment in the shingles. You have wooden shingles. You have fishtail shingles. You see on the third floor on the left, there's a section that has fishtail shingles. There's a word for you that you don't hear every day. It has pattern shingles. It has carved wood panels, which you'll see more of on the other side. The encircling porch goes around the property. It has a multi-gabled roof. And actually, that section of the front that's curved is really a very, very, elegant gable. So it's an incredible property. You can see the dormer up on the third floor. And as we go around the property, we're going to see some very, very significant parts of Victorian architecture. You can see the recessed porch, the one we just referred to. There's one on the third floor. And even the fishtail shingles way up on the gable on the third floor. The builders and the architects in those days just had a playful imagination. And that playfulness, we enjoy that playfulness to this day. We're going to go around to the, actually not to the, we're going to do the other side of the house after we do two other houses. So we're going to have to skip around because of the route, otherwise we'd be zigzagging back and forth. In back of me is the home that was owned by George P. Crafts. George Crafts was a shoe manufacturer that came to Manchester in the 1890s. And the place on 2nd Street in West Hancock, where Families in Transition has its furniture sales room, do you know where I mean, people? Well, that was a factory, and that was Crafts and Green Shoe Factory. Brought into this country when stock was sold to investors here in Manchester, and then they brought in the shoe factory. George Crafts, as I said, was a shoe manufacturer, and this house was called a colonial style structure, and it was very unusual because it was built on a system of curves rather than angles. Mr. Crafts could rightly be called the father of golf in Manchester. He was instrumental in establishing the first club here and was the first president of the Intervale Country Club, and one of the first members of the Manchester Country Club. Mr. Crafts' foursome often included Frank P. Carpenter, Herman Straub, and Henry Parker. George Crafts died in 1939, leaving the home vacant until 1942. The current law firm purchased the property in 1999. The style of this house is known as Colonial Revival, which started in about 1880, and you can still see it today in many of the construction today. It's most often a combination of various colonial styles and contemporary elements. Generally, the Revival house is larger than its colonial counterparts, and some of the individual elements are exaggerated and out of proportion with the other parts of the house. If we were to go around to the front, we would see an accentuated front door with a decorative pediment. The facade is often symmetrical, so this is not asymmetrical like the Victorian. This is a Colonial Revival. The doors may have side lights or a fan light, so-called a fan that looks like a fan, above the door. The windows are double hung, usually multi-paneled and often in pairs. The roofs are gabled or hipped and often topped with a flat deck with a railing. So this home has really been through a lot of history, and the current owners have gone to a lot of trouble to preserve this house, and they deserve a lot of credit. But many of these Victorian homes take deep pockets, and I don't quite understand why lawyers would have deep pockets, but apparently somebody could educate me on that. But in fact, it seems that lawyers and doctors seem to have bought a lot of the property today. And opposite me, the brick house just opposite me, and if you would look at that brick house, you will see that was this is an absolutely stunning house. I want to call your attention first to that soaring chimney, and I want you to look at that finial. That finial, for some reason that I can't quite understand, it's wholly subjective. I enjoy that finial enormously because every time I do this tour, you can see it outlined against the sky in a way that many of the finials you can't see. And that's a beautiful, beautiful finial. This home was built by Horatio Heath H-E-A-T-H. In 1888, its architect was George W. Stevens, who is probably the most famous for his designing of the Ash Street and the Lincoln Street schools. Mr. Heath was manager of the Manchester Beef Company. The house was best known in its day as the home, however, of J. Brodie Smith, Brodie, B-R-O-D-I-E, J. Brodie Smith, general manager of the Manchester Traction Power and Light Company, which became Public Service Company of New Hampshire. And he also was manager of the Manchester Street Railway, which is what the trolleys were called. Mr. Smith and his wife, Dr. Charlotte Stewartson Smith, lived here from 1918 until his death. What you should know, however, about J. Brodie Smith is that he was one of the most remarkable men that ever came to the city of Manchester. In 1930, he had the first television set in Manchester in this home. He received images broadcast from station WLXAV in Brookline, Mass. He was the first man in the state to receive pictures over the ether, as they called it in those days. The image was of a man stroking his chin and scratching his ears. Isn't that important to know? In 1921, March 1st, another first, at his house he heard Enrico Caruso from Washington, D.C. And again in 1921, he heard a conversation by wireless telephony from Santa Catalina Island, California. And the newspaper article says, Mr. J. Brodie Smith has purchased the H.W. Heath residence. It will be equipped with telephone service in each room in the house, wired for electricity, and there will be installed a permanent vacuum cleaner and sweeper system in the house. That was with a motor in the basement just as they have today, and you just plug in the hose. He was way ahead of his time. He had a summer home on the top of Mount Uncanunic. The man really enjoyed, adventure and also innovation. So that house is it used to have wires going from the carriage house to the house, and there was a huge antenna on top of the carriage house. It would look bizarre today, but I've seen pictures of it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to walk down toward Elm Street. We best to cross the street first, and then walk down, and we will stop, and I will do some of this side of the John M. Chandler house. But I invite you to look from this angle, and you see how the roof, the multi-plane roof, you've got a roof on one plane that comes down from where the chimney is, right, down to the third floor. Then you have another roof to the right that comes down and sweeps down to the first floor. Now that is not easy to build. I don't think it could be built today. It would last this long, but isn't that spectacular? We're going to walk to the other side of the sidewalk again and walk toward Elm Street. Thank you. I'm just going to stop here for a second because I'm right now on the north side of the John M. Chandler house. There's so much on this side. Look at the Medusa. Is that unbelievable? It's in bas-relief right on the side of the building. Look at the window, that little display of that curved window, and there's another curved window here. There's another recessed porch. Look at the treatment on the second floor of the glass and the stained glass. And you see fishtail shingles and pattern shingles in the same configuration on the top floor. You can't possibly say enough about this building. This has been studied by students. There are pictures of this house in books that are studied at Harvard University. Field trips are taken from colleges in Massachusetts and New Hampshire just to study this house. This is as historic a house, I don't know, next to the Stark House. Probably this would be the next one, I would say. I just wanted to point that all out so you can, I hope it whets somebody's appetite to study Victorian architecture. We're going to move down to the next house. What we have in back of us is the Charles E. Balch house. I'll try to talk louder and slower because of the fact that we are fighting traffic noise, and I'm aware of that. This house was built in 1883 for Charles E. Balch, cashier of the Manchester National Bank, a director of the New Hampshire Company, and a treasurer of the Manchester Gas Company. Mr. Balch had excellent architectural taste, and he designed this home himself. He also designed the Chase Block. The Chase Block, prior to that, had another name to it, but right now it is where there's a Mexican restaurant at the corner. I can't think of the name of it right now. Margaritas. Thank you. So that is the Chase Block, and he designed that. If you'll notice this home and the Chase Block, they both have a rounded facade. I have a picture of both, and they're identical. I'm going to look around here, and if you look at the corner, you see how, where my finger's pointed, see how that's all rounded there? And see how the windows are like upside down U's? The exact same thing if you go downtown. And if you look at the Chase Block, you'd be looking at the corner of Concord and Elm from across the street. You'll see it best from that angle. You'll see the exact same thing. Mr. Balch died 1 year after completion of this house, and upon his death, his widow came into possession. Upon the death of his widow, the home in 1903 came into possession of the Manchester Institute of Arts and Sciences, but the trustees felt that it was not suitable for the purposes and built on Pine and Concord Streets. The Balch Hospital, given in memory of her husband by Mrs. Balch, opened in 1919. He had an interest in a number of vessels, one of which was a four-masted schooner, the C.E. Balch, an 843-ton ship built in Bath, Maine. Can we imagine that? The Balch Carriage House and Stable was built in 1889 for the Balch family. A newspaper article of 1881 said that Colonel Charles E. Balch is directing the work of grading and laying the foundation for the erection of a new house at his fine large lot on Elm Street, on the site of the former center entrance to the fairgrounds. You remember I mentioned the center entrance was on North Street? This is the site of the center entrance to the fairgrounds. The south entrance was on where the Dover House was, Ken Scarpetti's house at the corner of Sagamore and Bay. So we have those two reference points. But what has to be said about this house is that its style of architecture. This is Italian villa style. This is a very, very standard style for its day. It had a tall tower or turret. We passed that as we walked down the street. On the other side, it's the only house that I know of where there's as obvious a turret that's part of the house. It has a gentle pitch to the roof. You see a gentle pitch. They had a grouping of straight or round-headed windows in groups of 3. That was also typical of a Italian villa house. It had, as I said, a low-pitch roof. It had a tall tower. You can see that. The windows were tall, narrow windows with inverted U's. I think I've mentioned that to you. It had a decorative crown. You can see that. There was a placement of the porches traditionally on the corner. If I look around here and I look at the corner, you will see that where those windows, those 3 windows are on the right, that's where there was once a porch. That's an addition. So this is a distinctly different style from any other building of its in Manchester, but it's a beautiful building. And the finial, F-I-N-I-A-L, you got it? Finial, asymmetry, recessed porches, wraparound porches. The finial was restored about 10 years ago. I think we can all remember a lot of that. And that must have cost an ungodly amount of money to restore that, but it is gorgeous. It's, again, one of the finest in the city. So there you have it. We're going to move north now.
Matt wants to say something.
Yes, we have one.
Inverted window. What does that mean?
Inverted upside down window?
Yeah. The U-shaped window.
A U-shaped window. The U is inverted.
The U's upside down.
The U is upside down.
At the top.
See, a U is usually the curved part on the bottom, so it's an inverted U-shaped window.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, that's it.
I just wanted to expand a little bit on a story that Dick touched on, mentioning the Institute of Arts and Sciences. The year before Mrs. Balch died, 1902, there was a massive fire in the Carriage Block downtown. The entire building was lost, and the loss was estimated at about $500,000 at the time. And one of the groups that was in there was the Manchester Institute of Arts and Sciences, which is the precursor of the Institute of Art that we have today. So they lost their entire collection of natural history things and art and all of these amazing, amazing artifacts. So when Mrs. Balch died, they were already looking for a space, and so the estate was offered to them, but they said a private residence like this just isn't a sufficient building for a museum. You know, it doesn't have moisture control, it doesn't have any of these things. And so they decided that it would actually be better to rent a building downtown than it would be to come to this beautiful mansion. So imagine an alternate history where this is the New Hampshire Institute of Art. I think that could have been a really neat thing. This brick building behind me was built in 1882 for Charles F. Morrill of the Commonwealth Bank and treasurer of the Granite State Telephone Company, and he was also an officer of the People's Fire Insurance Company. The architecture was originally Queen Anne and Eastlake style, and the architect was William Butterfield. It was said to contain the best pressed brick available at the time of construction. On July 26, 1893, Mr. Morrill boarded a train and left Manchester, leaving his wife behind. He carried a small package of books, presumably the records of the People's Fire Insurance Company and the Commonwealth Bank. The two institutions had just collapsed, and Mr. Morrill, being an officer, was involved. The stockholders of the bank offered a $1,000 reward for Mr. Morrill, suspecting that he had embezzled the bank's money. So Mr. Morrill fled to Argentina and died in Buenos Aires in 1897. His body was brought back in 1900 and buried in the Pine Grove Cemetery. In 1894, F.M. Hoyt, the shoe manufacturer, bought the home and extensively remodeled it.
I want to say something about that.
Turn to the camera.
I have to turn around to do that. I just want to mention that the F.M. Hoyt Shoe Company was just mentioned. We have with us today a lady who is writing a book on the shoe industry in Manchester, and F.M. Hoyt was the owner of the Beacon Shoes in Manchester, which was huge in its day, perhaps one of the biggest next to the McElwain shoe. And if anybody here has information or work for the shoe industry, she would be interested in talking with you.
Take your name and email. If you work at any of the shoe companies that were in the city, probably McElwain being the last one, or Subalkin or Murray Shoe and that kind of thing, let me know. I'd love to hear stories. I'm looking for anecdotal. Your relatives, talk to them already. And John Clayton
There you
on
go.
Facebook.
Mill Yard Museum.
Mill Yard Museum as well.
Sign up there.
Please send your stories in. We'll get them in the book. The book will be available most likely next summer.
From here?
Yep. So if you look directly across the street at this neat house over here, this is the Frank P. Carpenter home. And it was built in 1891, and it's a Queen Anne style residence. Mr. Carpenter was Manchester's greatest philanthropist. He was called our #1 citizen and the benefactor of Manchester, and rightly so. Some of his gifts to the city include the Carpenter Memorial Library, the Manchester Historic Association building. He contributed to the YMCA and YWCA, and numerous other buildings in the state and city.
Camp Carpenter, the Boy Scouts.
Oh, Camp Carpenter of the Boy Scouts, too. In 1887, Mr. Carpenter purchased the first of several lots he assembled over a 25-year period from the Amoskeag Company. 4 years later, he began constructing this house and the Carriage House. The two other houses on the side of the street between North and Webster are also linked to the Carpenter family. Carpenter's daughter, Mary, married Charles Manning, whose family lived next door at 1838 Elm Street. A house at the north end of the block, now the VNA site, was built in 1889 by Josiah Carpenter as a wedding gift for his daughter. In 1926, the home was bought by attorney Patrick Sullivan, his son John, and Priscilla Manning, the daughter of Charles and Mary. So they bought it together as a couple. Around 1910, he erected a bowling alley just west of the Carriage House. And this is a private home today. It was later used as a kindergarten, the first Montessori school in New Hampshire from 1922 to 1938. The Carpenter House was offered to the Red Cross in 1941 for the duration of the war, and it's still in its possession today. Upon Mr. Carpenter's death in 1938, the Manchester Union, in an editorial, said the following, quote, "It will not be hard to fill the place of Frank Carpenter. It will be impossible."
If we can call your attention to the big tree at the left-hand side of the building, it's a very tall tree, but look at the base, how wide it is. That is a rare copper beech tree, and there are specialists who come in every year to check the health. That's a very old tree. The Manchester Historic Association also holds an historic easement on this building, which means that we have kind of a final say before any sort of significant renovations can be done to the property.
And I just want to mention one item here. And you remember that on the John Dover house at the corner of Sagamore and Bay Street, I talked about the tower, the Conical Tower. This has a Conical Tower. But although I had passed this many, many times, countless times in my life, not until recently did I notice the thing I had missed. If you come down the facade of that tower down to where the diameter is the biggest in the bottom, that could have been built so that it was round, couldn't it? But instead of that, he made it multi-plane. I am convinced that in its day, that the people, when they were building houses, Victorian houses, and these splendid mansions, they were in competition with each other. I can do something on my tower you can't do. My Wraparound Porches got features yours don't have. Well, you look at that in that multi-plane. If anybody is a mathematical skill to tell me how many planes there are as it goes around that tower on the bottom, I'd be interested. But that would cost a fortune to do today, and I don't even know if anybody is alive that could do it.
So we're just going to keep moving north to this next brick house up the road. Behind me is the house that George W. Stevens designed, and it was completed on October 1st, 1879, the year he and his new bride moved in. It cost $15,000. Mr. Stevens was chief engineer and architect for the Amoskeag Mills, designing many of the mill buildings that stand today. He was the architect of the Governor Straub Mansion, the Ash Street School, Lincoln Street School, the original City Library, and the Central Fire Station. Today, the Ash Street School is on the National Register of Historic Places. Laura Hood Johnson, the daughter of H.P. Hood, the founder of the Milk Company, lived here for many, many years. George W. Stevens was also the architect of the Big Chimney, built by the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company. And when built, it was the tallest structure on the East Coast, 40 feet higher than the Bunker Hill Monument. It remained the tallest structure in Manchester's history until 1994, when the 9X building was erected next to City Hall. And most of us remember this building as housing Channel 9, the television station, but not me because I'm too young.
So this house is symmetrical.
This house is symmetrical.
It's still Victorian.
Yep.
You want to restate the question for the...
The question was asked, the statement was made that this house is symmetrical, therefore it is still Victorian. I wouldn't call this house Victorian myself.
I would.
I mean, it has some decorative brickwork, but I wouldn't call that classical Victorian in any way, shape, or manner.
Thank you.
Victoria was queen, it counts.
Yeah, exactly.
In back of me, you find the Thomas W. Wheat home, 1837 Elm Street. This home was built in 1884 for Thomas Wheat, a physician in Manchester. Dr. Wheat was the first in a long line of prominent doctors to descend from him and play an important part in the city's history. Many of you remember the name Dr. Wheat, I'm sure. His wife Augusta was the daughter of Jonathan T.P. Hunt. Her father built the first starch mill in 1838 for the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company and was on the committee to build the first city hall. After construction of the first boarding house at Stark and Canal Street, Mr. Hunt sent for his wife, and she arrived by stagecoach at Amoskeag Village. She became the first woman to live in the new city of Manchester. In 1903, Dr. Wheat built an auto house for his new car. That's pretty early for a car in Manchester in 1903. We believe that this may have been the first garage ever constructed in the city of Manchester. All right. I'm going to do right now the house just opposite. So if you can direct your eyes to that beautiful home just opposite you. This home was built in 1892 for Charles H. Manning, General Superintendent of the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company. The Amoskeag Manufacturing Company built this home for Captain Manning, although they held ownership of it. Before coming to the Amoskeag, Captain Manning was an officer in the United States Navy and taught engineering at Annapolis. While at the Amoskeag, he supervised the construction of the company's great power plant. The famous Manning boilers were made by him also. He was an architect and he was a builder of the Coolidge Mill in West Manchester. Captain Manning was also a personal friend of George Westinghouse, the inventor. Tragedy came to this family. 3 of his sons were killed in a tragic train accident in 1924 while walking along a railroad track in Glencliff, New Hampshire. They had gone up to Glencliff on a vacation to do hiking in the wintertime. There was a group of friends that would go there every year. There was a blinding snowstorm. They checked at the station because part of the trip to the cabin that they were going to was along the railroad track. And then they would leave the railroad track and walk by another route to the cabin. But there was a blinding snowstorm. They didn't hear the train approaching. It was not a scheduled train. The train struck them, taking the lives of all 3. The tragedy was magnified because one of them was the husband of Mrs. Mary Manning. And the granddaughter, the granddaughter, Margaret Vanderveer of Captain Manning, wrote in an article, and this article was written by somebody that maybe he is present, John Clayton. He wrote an article on Margaret Vanderveer, and the article was written in 1993. And in the article, she says that, like their father, the Manning boys shared the same congenital hearing disorder, and that, combined with a heavy snowfall, prevented them from hearing the train rushing up behind them. Reportedly, it was Henry Ford's private train, bound for Montreal from Boston. The brothers were struck and killed instantly. That's the story of this house, and it's a gorgeous, beautiful house. It was restored about, I think, maybe about 10 to 12 years ago, and the work was magnificent. It looks as though it was just painted yesterday. I don't know how they did it, but it's just beautiful. So that's the story of this house.
Behind me was built about 1888, the year that it was purchased by Mr. Isaac W. Smith for $10,000. The architect was Stickney of Lowell, Massachusetts, the architect for the Eliot Hospital and the Varney School. It was built as a parsonage for the Franklin Street Congregational Church, but was never actually used for that purpose. It's built in the Queen Anne style, and Isaac Smith was an Associate Justice of the New Hampshire Supreme Court, and at one time was Mayor of Manchester. His wife Amanda had an unusual distinction. Her father, Herman Brown, was the first mayor of the city. Her husband, Isaac, was also a mayor. Her son, Edward, was also a mayor, and therefore she was the daughter, wife, and mother of a mayor. In June 1918, Congressman Chester Jenks owned the house and remodeled it into what was called a Floridian appearance. And the article in the Manchester Mirror newspaper went on to say that people would never recognize the old home. Across the street at the Yellow House, John J. Andrew built this house in 1893. And upon his death at the age of 90, he was the oldest practicing attorney in the state of New Hampshire. The local newspaper commented on the building of the house in the following way, quote, "Mr. Andrews' home is not exceptionally large one, although it's very elegant. Still it was built with more of an eye for comfort and convenience than to size and showiness. 1 minute walk from the horse cars and 3 minutes from Webster Street Depot, Mr. Andrews thinks himself well located." End quote. Mr. Andrews' wife was the daughter of Waterman Smith, a one-time agent of the Manchester Print Works and the president of the First National Bank. Their daughter married Joseph Herman, the largest manufacturer of silk handkerchiefs in the world. And Mrs. Andrews was one of the founders of the Manchester Historic Association. Now, if you look just up to this white house here, or light gray, however you want to say it, this is the Bushrod Hill home, and it was built about 1899 for Mr. Hill, who is one of the owners of the Hill and Company Express. Mr. Hill came to Manchester in the 1840s and started the business soon after. They delivered to Boston, Lawrence, and numerous points south, east, and west of Manchester. In 1882, Mr. Hill bought out his brothers and ran the business alone until 1894, when he sold it to the American Express Company. In 1873, Mr. Hill had built in Bath, Maine, a three-masted 675-ton schooner to ship paving blocks to New Orleans, and it was appropriately named the Bushrod W. Hill. So we're looking at this yellow house on the corner right here. This is the John C. French house, and construction of it began in 1890. John C. French was the founder of the New Hampshire Fire Insurance Company, a very successful business here in Manchester for many years. In 1869, he conceived the idea of a stock fire insurance company, interested some prominent Manchester men to invest with him, and the business flourished. Mr. French was also the first president of the Manchester Historic Association. So we're just going to go up to the corner of Webster and Elm now, and Dick's going to finish us off.
On November 18th, 1864, folks in Manchester picked up a newspaper to read the following, quote, "By order dated November 18th, 1864, from the Surgeon General, the U.S. General Hospital in Manchester is to be renamed the Webster USA General Hospital, Manchester. As we've already said, but for the Civil War and this hospital, this street would not be named Webster. The name Webster was chosen for it wholly due to the influence of Daniel Webster and some influential senators that were able to get to the War Department in Washington to force the renaming of this hospital. So what happened was this: Webster Street had not been laid out yet. There was no Webster Street. When they laid out Webster Street was named after the hospital, which in fact was named, if you follow, after Daniel Webster. Then when they did the DW Highway, it was natural to call it the DW Highway because it flowed into Webster Street. So that's some of the trivia of history that you might be interested in. But here at Webster and Elm, we're at the crossroads in the history of the North End. You look at this filling station in back of you. From 1883 until 1960, a beautiful brick home occupied that site, the Walter Parker Estate. Its original owner, Frederick C. Dow, was a wealthy shoe dealer who occupied it until 1895, when Walter Parker, the banker, became its longest-term owner, occupying it until his death in 1927. The first owner, Mr. Dow, it was told, had the most complete and up-to-date tennis court in the city, right where the fruit stand now stands, and on the same site the Parker family built a large enclosed greenhouse just behind their home. I have a picture of that greenhouse on my hard drive. It's really gorgeous. The house, after Walter Parker's death, was occupied by his son-in-law, Norman F. Milne, and 12 years later, in 1939, it became the Russell Rest Home. But some of us will remember it in the 1950s as a site of Lee's Chinese Restaurant. Lee's Chinese Restaurant was on Hanover Street, but like anyone else, he wanted to expand. So he built a second North End, Lee's Chinese Restaurant. But Webster Street was as well the northern boundary of the land owned by the Amoskeag. For 30 years in the 19th century, it was the end of Elm Street. An 1899 news article actually referred to the area north of Clark Street as the extreme North End. North of Clark Street, the extreme North End. There were only 2 or 3 or 4 houses up there at that point in time. The trolley line was extended northward from Webster Street to Clark Street in 1896, and then from Clark to Carpenter in 1900. I can barely remember it when I was just a toddler. I was actually a little bit more than a toddler, but I can barely remember it. With this, we're going to bring this tour to an end. We could go on and on and on. And the second part of the tour is going to begin at the, it'll be next month. It will begin
August 11th.
August 11th. And it will begin at the Brookside Church. And it's a really fascinating part of the tour. We're going to be going down Clark Street to Chestnut, then we're coming back up to Elm, going north on Elm. When we get to Carpenter, we're going to be going down Carpenter as far as Chestnut, and then actually as far as North Adams. And then we're coming back and we're going north on Elm. We would be crossing through the Bishop's property to River Road and doing some of the houses there on River Road that we've all driven by and wonder what the history was. So we hope to see you on the August 11th tour. And we hope you've enjoyed this tour. So Manchester's a fascinating place. And I could spend the rest of my life studying it, and I still wouldn't begin to touch the surface of. There's so much written about it. A wonderful city.
Thank you very much, all of you, for coming today.
Trivia question.
Questions, okay?
Trivia question.
Yes. Good. See, I was relying on the fact that somebody would remind me of that. John Stark lived in the Stark House. We all know that. His father was Archibald Stark. Archibald Stark came from Glasgow, and he attended the University of Glasgow, where he got his college degree at the University of Glasgow. That's the answer to the trivia question. Thank you, sir, for reminding me. I wouldn't have slept tonight if you hadn't done that.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you all very much. Have a safe walk back to your cars, and we hope to see you again next month. Thank you.